If there is one stage of investing that almost nobody describes honestly enough, it is the beginning. The beginning is not elegant. It is not cinematic. It is not the part people brag about at dinner. It is the part where you keep doing the right thing and your account still looks too small to justify the emotional effort. That is where most people lose. Not in the crash, not in the recession, not in the great scandal or the famous panic. They lose in the dull years, when the arithmetic is still too small to impress them and the discipline feels much larger than the reward. I have always found that interesting. Human beings will endure quite a lot of pain if the pain arrives wrapped in drama. They will train for a marathon, build a business from nothing, work brutal hours to get a career moving. But ask them to invest a few $100s every month for years, while visible progress stays unimpressive, and many of them begin to feel insulted by the pace. That is because compounding does not flatter the ego early. It embarrasses it. You make the deposit, you wait, you check. And the number still looks like something life could erase with one bad quarter. That is when the doubt begins. I want to tell you about a young woman I once spoke with. I will call her Veronica. She was 28, sensible, employed, disciplined enough to do what most people say they want to do, and very few actually do. She had been investing $200 every month for years. No drama, no gambling, no constant changes, no hot stock obsession. She was doing the ordinary thing the financial world tells ordinary people to do. And one afternoon she looked at the balance and felt a kind of private discouragement she was embarrassed to admit out loud. She had been faithful. The account had grown, but it still looked too small to carry the emotional weight she had placed on it. That is the phase where many people walk away. They do not always cash out dramatically. Sometimes they simply stop caring. They stop adding. They start postponing. They decide they will return when income is higher, or when the market feels better, or when motivation comes back, or when they feel more certain. That quiet drifting away may be even more expensive than a visible panic, because it usually happens without enough pain to create a lesson. It simply steals years, and years are the raw material compounding needs most. What Veronica was experiencing was not proof that investing had failed her. It was proof that she had not yet crossed the point where the machine begins to feel alive. That point matters enormously. People think compounding is a philosophy. It is not, it is a sequence. It has a rhythm. And if you misunderstand the rhythm, you may quit right before the process stops feeling humiliating and starts feeling powerful. Most financial advice is too vague on this subject. It says be patient, stay consistent, think long term. All of that is fine, but very little of it tells a person what patience is supposed to feel like while the account is still small. It feels thankless. It feels slow. It feels unfair compared with the emotional urgency of the present. It feels like pushing hard on something that barely moves. That is why I prefer to be honest about the beginning. The beginning is heavy because your labor is doing almost all of the work. Your money is still too small to help meaningfully. Later, the roles begin to change. That is what people do not understand. Early on, you are carrying the machine. Later, the machine begins carrying you. The transition between those two states is where real wealth begins. Now, I have spent incentives and the quiet ways behavior compounds. One lesson I learned very early is that a person's success often depends less on knowing the final answer than on knowing the shape of the process well enough not to abandon it prematurely. Compounding has a shape. The early line looks flat enough to offend you, then it bends, then it surprises you. Then, if you respected it long, it begins doing what impatient people always wanted it to do. Only now they are no longer around to enjoy it because they left before the turn. This is one reason I have never been impressed by people who want to get rich quickly. The desire itself reveals that they do not understand the kind of force they are trying to harness. Real compounding is not built to entertain you in the opening act. It is built to reward the person who can stay rational while the opening act feels too ordinary to justify itself. That is rare, which is why the result is valuable. If I had to explain the whole thing to an ordinary investor in a way that was practical rather than poetic, I would frame it around 4 thresholds. The first is time, the second is structure, the third is, and the fourth is escalation. Most people think only about return. That is why they keep misunderstanding the experience. Return is only one ingredient. Time without interruption matters. Structure without foolish concentration matters. Emotional survival through boredom and fear matters, and gradually increasing the fuel matters. If even one of those is missing, the process weakens. If all 4 are present, something very interesting begins to happen. Now let me start with time, because time is the part people claim to understand while repeatedly behaving as if they do not. When I say investing needs time, most people nod too quickly. What they usually mean is that they have heard the sentence before. They do not mean they have If an investor is going to give compounding a real chance, he needs to think in a stretch long enough for the market to experience a full emotional cycle, not just a pleasant quarter or a fashionable year. That is why I like 7 years as a minimum unit of serious commitment, not because the number is magical in some mystical sense, because it is long enough to absorb enough nonsense, a good year, a bad year, a correction, a recovery, an overexcited period, a disappointing period, a moment where headlines insist the world changed permanently, a moment where the same headlines later pretend the panic was obvious and temporary. 7 years tends to contain enough of life that the investor finally stops treating every month as a referendum on the entire project. That psychological change is worth a great deal. The person with a 1-year mind is still living in emotional weather. The person with a 7-year mind begins thinking in climate. That is where strength starts. The market is cruel to the 1-year mind. It offers just enough randomness to keep hope and fear taking turns at the steering wheel. But the 7-year mind sees something else. It sees that businesses adapt, economies bend, prices overreact, fear exaggerates, and time does what time always does to disciplined ownership of productive assets. It reduces noise to a cost of admission. This is not because the market becomes perfectly smooth over 7 years. It does not. It is because the investor begins seeing rough periods as part of the contract rather than as evidence he was tricked. That distinction matters immensely. If volatility is interpreted as betrayal, people quit. If volatility is interpreted as part of the deal, people continue. I remember once talking with a man who loved to say he was a long-term investor. Then one rough year arrived, and he behaved like a frightened tourist who had taken a wrong turn. He was not a long-term investor at all. He was a short-term investor who liked the language of patience when prices were cooperating. That is very common. A true long horizon is not something you declare in a good market. It is something you discover about yourself in a disappointing one. 7 years is a good test because it forces the mind to leave the shallow pool of monthly emotional accounting. If you only look 1 or 2 years ahead, every dip feels personal. Every flat stretch feels insulting. Every crash feels like proof that prudence was foolish. By the time a person genuinely commits 7 years, he starts asking different questions. Am I still buying productive assets? Am I still diversified sensibly? Am I still adding? Am I still allowing time to do its work? Those are adult questions. The shorter ones are adolescent questions. Why am I not ahead yet? Why is this taking so long? Why did someone else's hot asset move faster? That kind of thinking is expensive. So yes, the first condition is time, but time alone is not enough. A fool can hold the wrong thing for 10 years and learn nothing except endurance and error. Which brings me to structure. A great many people think they are diversified when all they have really done is bought several versions of the same risk. 5 tech funds are not 5 engines. 5 fashionable growth stories are not structure. A cluster of exciting assets that all depend on the same easy money environment is not diversification. It is concentration wearing a polite mask. I have always preferred simple structure that can survive multiple environments. If I were guiding a younger investor building real long-term wealth, I would want the portfolio to be built from several distinct categories that behave differently enough to keep the owner sane and invested. Broad market ownership would be the foundation. That means ordinary ownership in large collections of productive businesses rather than worship of 1 or 2 names. A broad market index does not offer much ego pleasure because nobody can brag convincingly about something so rational. That is one reason it works. It bypasses the urge to prove cleverness. The great advantage of broad market ownership is not excitement. It is that civilization, ingenuity, productivity, and profit seeking are all being asked to work on your behalf at once. That is an extraordinary machine for an ordinary person to own. Then I would want exposure to businesses or funds that emphasize dividend discipline. Not because dividends are magic, but because cash being sent back to the owner creates a different psychological experience. Even when prices are not entertaining you, the cash flow reminds you that ownership can still be productive, that matters. People talk about total return, and they are correct to do so. But the human mind is steadier when it can see some evidence of life even in a slow or flat market. Then I would want a smaller but meaningful portion in faster growing parts of the market, smaller companies, mid-sized growth engines, places where the future can still surprise on the upside if you are patient enough to tolerate the volatility. Not a reckless portion, a measured one, enough to let the portfolio breathe with more than one kind of engine. Then I would want international exposure, because a person who owns only one national market is often confusing familiarity with prudence. The United States is a magnificent business culture, but the world is wider than one flag, and opportunities do not ask permission to arise only where you happen to live. Owning some part of the wider world is not a betrayal of home. It is basic realism. And finally, I would want some defensive layer, cash reserves, treasury bills, shorter duration stability perhaps, depending on the person, a modest bond allocation. Something that does not exist to thrill but to steady. Why? Because compounding does not survive if the owner cannot survive himself. I have seen people hold aggressive portfolios in good times and speak about risk as though courage were their natural inheritance. Then the market finally behaves like a market, and suddenly courage becomes a rumor from an earlier season. The defensive layer is not there because I expect it to outperform everything else. It is there because not blowing yourself up emotionally is one of the highest return decisions in investing. That is a very important point. Volatility alone does not destroy compounding. Emotional reaction to volatility does. A sound structure reduces the odds that you will abandon the plan at precisely the wrong moment. Now, I do not think structure needs to be complicated. In fact, complexity is one of the great scams sold to insecure investors. A beautiful portfolio is often one you can explain to an intelligent teenager in a few clear sentences. I own broad businesses. I own some dividend discipline. I own some smaller future engines. I own some of the world outside my home country. And I own some stability so that I can remain rational when headlines become theatrical. That is plenty. The purpose is not to sound sophisticated. The purpose is to stay in the arena long enough for time to help. And that leads directly to the third threshold, which is emotion. Most investors do not fail the arithmetic test first. They fail the emotional test. There are 3 emotional phases that try very hard to destroy a compounding life before it becomes powerful. The first is doubt. This arrives early. You are doing the work. Deposits are being made. Nothing obviously wrong is happening. And still the account feels too small. This is when your mind begins whispering that you must be missing something. Someone at work bought a certain stock and cannot stop talking about it. A cousin claims crypto changed his life. Another person says you are being too conservative. Doubt is not dramatic. It is corrosive. It makes ordinary discipline feel naive. That is dangerous, because most foolish decisions begin with a desire not to feel left behind. Doubt tells people that patience is for people who do not know any better. Later, the same people discover that patience was the entire point. The second emotional phase is frustration. This tends to arrive after some years have passed. Now the account is no longer tiny, but it still is not impressive enough to justify the sacrifices in a way your emotions find satisfying. You have said no to purchases, you have automated contributions, you have behaved better than the old version of yourself, and still the result looks like something life could injure in one rough year. This is where many people cash out for a car, a trip, a house project, or some story they tell themselves about investing in life while quietly interrupting the most important compounding years. Frustration is the phase where the person thinks he is being practical. In reality, he is usually being impatient with a process that was just beginning to gain mass. This is why the middle years are so important. They do not feel like the explosion. They feel like the part right before the explosion becomes visible. The person who survives frustration has a chance at the later rewards. The person who cannot tolerate frustration is usually condemned to keep restarting, and restarting is one of the most expensive habits in investing. The third phase is panic. This one arrives with much more drama. The market falls. Headlines turn poisonous. The account shrinks. Now the investor is no longer merely bored or annoyed. He is frightened. This is when he begins asking the wrong question. How do I stop the pain? That question has ruined many fortunes. The right question is different. Has the long-term logic changed, or has the emotional temperature changed? Those are not the same thing. Every major panic feels final while you are in. That is one reason history matters so much. A person who knows the market's history knows that fear always arrives insisting it, is unprecedented, and recovery always arrives sooner than the frightened had imagined possible. A person without that history interprets every crash as personal proof that prudence was a trick. This is why I prefer investors who read. Not because reading sounds virtuous, because a read investor is harder to stampede. He has seen the movie before. Perhaps not this exact cast, not this exact crisis, not this exact policy debate, but the structure is familiar enough that he does not confuse emotional violence with permanent truth. Now, how do you survive doubt? Frustration and panic. You do not survive them by feeling stronger than other people. You survive them by building a system that reduces the number of decisions left to mood. That is what automation is for. That is what limited account checking is for. That is what written rules are for. If you check your portfolio every day, you are volunteering to experience all the emotional noise the market can manufacture. That is foolish. Daily checking is like digging up a seed every afternoon to see whether it has become a tree. Nothing good comes of it. I would rather a person check quarterly, or even less often if he is early in the accumulation years and knows he is vulnerable to emotional weather. The less often you invite noise into the room, the less often noise gets a vote. Automation matters for the same reason. If deposits rely on inspiration, they will happen inconsistently. If they happen before you have time to justify a better use for the money, the future finally gets treated like a serious claimant. That is adulthood in finance. Your future should not be the last mouth fed. It should be one of the first. And written rules matter because panic makes people forget who they intended to be. A person should know in advance what he will do when fear appears. Will I keep buying? Will I not sell broad productive assets merely because the price is lower? Will I review long-term history before making any major change? Will I wait a set number of days before acting on fear? Those rules are forms of pre-committed sanity. Sanity is valuable because markets periodically become insane in public. Now we come to the fourth threshold, which is escalation. This is the secret people underestimate most because it looks too modest to matter. Increase the contribution, not once in a grand gesture, regularly, quietly, proportionally. That is how small investors stop remaining small. If a person invests a fixed amount forever, he will still do better than most people. But if he increases the amount as life allows, raises bonuses paid, off debts, improves skill, lower expenses, maturity, then the compounding machine stops being fed a constant trickle and begins receiving a growing stream. That change is much more powerful than it appears on the surface. I like 5% a year as a useful mental model because it is small enough not to feel theatrical and meaningful enough to matter tremendously over long stretches. The public dramatically underestimates what gradual increases can do because the mind discounts anything that does not feel emotionally large. A $15 or $20 increase per month feels laughably small. Repeated year after year, it is not laughable at all. It can change the final outcome by hundreds of thousands of dollars over a working life. That is the kind of arithmetic I respect. Not arithmetic that requires heroism. Arithmetic that requires consistency. If your income rises and your contribution never does, you are living proof that lifestyle absorbed the entire raise. That is worth noticing. Too many people imagine they are progressing because the salary rose while their actual ownership of capital barely changed. The salary is not the game. The conversion rate from income into ownership is the game. That is why I care more about rising contributions than about rising income in isolation. Income can flatter. Contribution reveals. I knew a man whose earnings rose steadily for years while his investing stayed almost unchanged. He always had a reason: new apartment, better car, more travel, higher standards. He was not lying exactly. He was simply letting the present hire every dollar before the future could make a claim. Later, he looked at friends with similar career paths who had far more capital than he did and imagined they must have picked better investments. Usually they had not. Usually they had just let ownership rise as income rose. That is a much more ordinary explanation. Ordinary explanations are often the right ones. If you put all four thresholds together, time, structure, emotional survival, and rising fuel, you get a very different picture of compounding than the childish fairy tale many people carry in their heads. Compounding is not magic that visits the lucky. It is the consequence of staying in the right process long enough with a sound enough structure, through enough emotional discomfort, while feeding the engine more as your life strengthens. That is the real machine, and it is much less mysterious than people think. Let me go back to Veronica. Imagine her standing in year 5 with a balance that feels too small to dignify her sacrifice. At that point, the lazy interpretation is that nothing important is happening. The accurate interpretation is different. She has built the base. That is what people keep underestimating. A base does not look exciting when you are standing on top of it, but later everything depends on it. The base is the years of automatic deposits. No one admired. The base is the nights she did not spend money that would have interrupted the process. The base is the emotional training that taught her not to lunge at every shiny alternative. The base is the developing habit of letting some of life's income pass into ownership instead of immediate consumption. That is what the first years really buy. They buy mass, then later the mass begins to produce momentum. I sometimes think of compounding like a heavy flywheel. The first turns are exhausting and visually disappointing. You push and the thing barely seems to honor your labor. But each turn is not nothing. Each turn adds stored force. At some point, the wheel begins to cooperate. Then later, it begins to help. And eventually, it becomes powerful enough that a person who arrived late looks at it and assumes it was always easy. That assumption is the insult paid to early discipline. We should be honest about that. The early years were not easy. They were simply necessary, and necessity rarely looks glamorous from the inside. One of the reasons I believe so strongly in broad-based patient investing is that it aligns beautifully with ordinary human limits, if the human being is humble enough to accept them. Most people are not going to outsmart the market consistently. Most people are not going to identify the one perfect growth company every cycle. Most people are not going to time exits and re-entries elegantly. Most people would do far better if they stopped trying to convert the market into an arena for self-display and instead treated it as a long-term machine for turning discipline into ownership. That is why the framework matters. It gives the mind something sturdier than impulse. Now, there is another dimension here that many people ignore, which is the identity that forms while all this is happening. An investor is not merely growing an account. He is becoming a person who thinks longer, a person who spends less reactively, a person who can defer pleasure without feeling erased, a person who can watch other people get excited and remain calm, a person who can survive boredom without sabotaging himself. These are not small developments. They are forms of wealth before the balance sheet fully reveals itself. I have known many high-income people with little of this inner architecture. Their statements could look strong for a while, but there was no real stability underneath because their behavior remained emotional, comparative, and impulsive. Then I have known moderate earners who built themselves into the kind of people compounding loves, consistent, calm, incremental, less needy for applause, more interested in the quiet strengthening of reality. Those people often outrun the louder ones over time. That is the beauty of compounding. It is biased toward temperament as much as toward arithmetic. Not perfect temperament, disciplined enough temperament. I want to say something else that I think people need to hear. The account balance is not always the best early scorecard. When the account is still small, the better scorecard is behavior. Did I contribute this month? Did I increase the amount when I could? Did I keep my structure intact? Did I resist foolish concentration? Did I stay invested when the market felt dramatic? Did I continue owning productive assets instead of worshiping predictions? Those are the right early questions. If you ask only, does the balance impress me yet? You are asking a late-stage question at an early-stage moment. That creates unnecessary despair. The better mindset is to celebrate consistency before the compounding curve becomes visually gratifying. Consistency is the first victory. The market owes you nothing for one good month of enthusiasm. It eventually pays a great deal for many years of sane repetition. That is a different bargain, much richer, much less exciting in the beginning. And because it is less exciting, most people will not keep it. That creates the opportunity for those who do. Now, I know some people hear all this and become discouraged by the length of the road. 7 years sounds long, 20 years sounds longer, 30 years sounds almost offensive to a culture trained in immediacy, but you must understand something important. The years will pass anyway. The question is what structure you will have inside time while it moves. One person lets the years pass through spending, comparison, emotional shifts, and interrupted attempts at investing. Another person lets the years pass through automatic ownership, increasing contributions, reasonable diversification, and emotional survival. After a decade, those are very different lives. Not because one person discovered hidden genius, because one person let time help instead of constantly resetting the process. Resetting is one of the most expensive behaviors in finance. People reset because they get impatient. They switch strategies, chase something hotter, sell during fear, stop contributing when life becomes annoying. Then later they restart and call it maturity. Usually it is just a new beginning after the cost of abandoning the old one. The fewer times you force yourself back to the beginning, the richer you tend to become. That is a very underrated truth. Start once. Continue. Increase the fuel when life allows. Do not keep yanking the roots up to inspect whether the tree feels impressive enough yet. Now, perhaps the most beautiful moment in an investor's life is not the day he becomes technically wealthy. It is the day he realizes the account is finally doing work he can feel. The annual market movement begins to exceed what he personally contributed, or the monthly dividend flow starts looking like something that matters, or the year-end growth, even in an ordinary year, begins to feel like the machine has some weight of its own. That is a profound moment because until then, a person often feels that he is dragging the entire enterprise forward through sheer labor. After that, he begins to feel assisted. That is when the account stops being merely a container for sacrifice and starts becoming a partner. Most people never reach that feeling because they quit too early or keep interrupting the process, which is tragic. Because once the partner becomes real, the whole psychology of wealth changes. The investor is no longer asking whether this month's deposit mattered. He is asking how to protect and strengthen an engine that now has a life of its own. That is a better problem to have. A much better one. So if you are in the early years and the account feels too small, let me say something plainly. The flatness of the line does not mean the process is broken. It means you are still in the phase where your discipline is carrying almost all the weight. That phase is not a sign of failure. It is the apprenticeship. Stay with it. If you are in the middle years and frustration is telling you that the result is too modest to justify further sacrifice, remember this. The middle is when people mistake preparation for stagnation. The middle is where mass is being built. It does not yet look explosive. It is becoming explosive. Stay with it. If you are in a panic year and fear is persuading you that this time is different enough to deserve abandoning the very structure that got you here, remember that every serious market event arrives insisting it is unique enough to justify emotional surrender. That is part of the pattern too. Stay with it. If your income has risen but your contribution has not, do not indulge yourself with stories about deserving every extra dollar in present consumption. Move some of that rise into ownership. That is how a life begins to change. Stay with it. And if you are the sort of person who always believed wealth belonged mainly to the lucky, the brilliant, the inherited, or the unusually aggressive, I would invite you to consider a quieter possibility. A surprising amount of wealth belongs to the person who was not seduced away from a sound process before the process matured. That person may not have looked extraordinary in year 2 or year 5, maybe not even year 7. But by year 15 and year 20, the world often mistakes that quiet discipline for natural advantage. It was not natural. It was chosen. Chosen again and again when the rewards still look too small to satisfy vanity. That is what makes the outcome valuable. So yes, I believe in the 7-year horizon. I believe in the 5-part structure. I believe in preparing for doubt, frustration, and panic before they arrive. And I believe very strongly in increasing the contribution as life strengthens. Not because I enjoy tidy formulas, because these are practical ways of protecting ordinary people from the main threats to compounding, which are impatience, concentration, emotional surrender, and static effort. Protect against those, and the arithmetic gets a chance to become astonishing. Ignore them, and even a decent income can spend decades producing disappointment. If I had to reduce the whole lesson to one sentence, it would be this: compounding does not fail most people. Most people fail compounding before compounding has time to reveal what it can do. That is the hard truth. It is also the hopeful truth, because it means the result is not reserved only for prodigies. It is available to disciplined people who understand the shape of the journey well enough not to abandon it in the ugly part. The ugly part comes first. That is the price. The beautiful part comes later. That is the return. And if you can accept that sequence, really accept it, not just nod at it, then your whole relationship with investing changes. You stop asking the market to entertain you. You stop demanding visible proof too early. You stop treating boredom as evidence something is wrong. You begin treating the early years as foundation, the middle years as acceleration, and the later years as the long-delayed reward for not interrupting the machine. That is how money starts working harder than you do. Not instantly, not theatrically, but surely enough that one day when you look back at the years that once felt painfully slow, you realize they were the most important years of all. They were the years that built the base, and the base is what makes the eventual lift possible. I would never mock the impatience people feel in the beginning. I understand it. I only want them not to obey it, because the beginning is not where you judge the promise. The beginning is where you prove you are capable of receiving it later. That is the whole game. Stay long enough. Structure wisely enough. Survive yourself well enough. Feed the machine a little more each year. Then let time, which was once your source of frustration, become your greatest financial accomplice. That is when the line bends. That is when the account starts feeling alive. And that is when all those unimpressive deposits from the years nobody respected begin to reveal that they were never small at all. They were simply early.